One of the interesting challenges of what we're trying to do in the Advent season is we are trying to take stories sort of on their own. The story of Tamar, the story of Rahab, the story of Ruth, and explore them, but we're exploring them with a specific purpose. Matthew included them in his genealogy, and so we're trying to figure out what they mean here in this place. And so some of my sermons this series and this month are kind of this weird, like almost two parts. What does it mean to explore Jesus' genealogy in the Gospel of Matthew, and then what does this individual story mean? And you'll hear that kind of two-part nature of this morning. And as we jump into our passage in Matthew chapter 1, it's worth considering the national debate that's been going on recently about what value there is in looking at the past. Our culture is filled with common sayings, and we've probably heard any number of these at any given moment. The past is past, right? Don't live in the past. The present is challenging enough. Why add in the past? Don't dig up the past. You can hear even in this last saying, right? The idea that the past is something that has died, that has been buried. It has been laid to rest, and it is to be left in peace. We wouldn't go digging up the dead, and so why would we dig up the past? You hear how that phrase kind of works. And this last week, the debates about the past revolved mostly around torture as part of our country's story and experience. In weeks prior, the past has been brought up in order to talk about race relations and our justice system. And some say we need to talk about the past if we are going to stand any chance of living a better future. And others say if we are going to move forward, we have to leave the past behind us. So which is it, right? I mean, these are radically different perspectives on the past. Let me suggest this morning, that as a people who are preparing to celebrate the birth of Jesus, we are people who are working to remember an event that happened 2,000 years ago. In other words, we are people who are seeking to live in light of the past. If God wants us to bury the past, then he was foolish to give us a book, a set of texts that pretty much just tells and retells the past of his people. I don't think God is foolish. I think his words have great wisdom. Wisdom, however, that requires a real sense that the past is important, and wisdom that has a growing understanding of what that past means. I think there is an intentional reason the Gospel of Matthew is the first book in the New Testament. See, Matthew has a real understanding that if you're interested in Jesus, you cannot just be interested in the miraculous birth, as miraculous as it may be. Matthew understands that you cannot just be interested and devote yourself to Jesus' teachings. And by themselves, his miracles do not tell you what you need to know. And it's not even just enough to say that Jesus died, was buried, and was raised from the dead. All of this, his birth, his life, his ministry, his death, his resurrection, they all mean something. And this month, this season of Advent, is devoted to exploring together that meaning. And we're doing it this year on Matthew's terms. And Matthew's terms are clear. If you want to understand Jesus, if you want to follow Jesus, if you want to trust Jesus and receive the life that Jesus is offering you, it all starts with the past. But see, this grinds against just about everything inside of us. We want to start with us. What difference does Jesus make in my life? How can Jesus fix my problems? How can Jesus make my marriage better? How can Jesus make me a better parent? How can Jesus help me be more content and satisfied and blessed or fulfilled or fill in the blank? But if you go to a Christian bookstore, all you have to do is look at the books that fill the top 10 lists, scan what is available, and it's these questions about how does Jesus affect my life that are the focus of these books and the answers we're seeking. But that's not where Matthew starts. The first book in the New Testament doesn't start by trying to attract us to this figure named Jesus. In fact, Matthew doesn't even start with Jesus. He starts with Jesus' family. And he starts with 1,000-year-old promises. If you want to understand Jesus and what all of this means, you got to go back, Matthew tells us. Before the Bible tells us anything about Jesus, it says, remember. Remember the promises that God made to Abraham. Remember the promises that God made to David. And then, remember Tamar and Rahab. Remember Ruth and Bathsheba. These women represent memories. But these memories are more than just sentimental snapshots of the past. They mean something. And they tell us something about who Jesus is and what Jesus means. And it's interesting that the stories of each of these women track with the evolution of the Israelites as a people. The story of Israel. Tamar comes into contact with God's people at their very beginnings, when they are still just a small family, hundreds of years away from seeing God's promises fulfilled. Rahab then comes into contact with God's people after they've grown from a small family into a great nation. However, rescued from slavery, they're still a homeless, wandering people waiting for God to bring them into the promised land. Ruth then comes into contact with God's people after God has given them their victory and their land. He's brought them into the land and they've settled this land that God has promised them. And then Bathsheba comes into contact with God's people at really the very pinnacle of their existence, when the kingdom of Israel is spreading with great power and influence. And so these four women, interestingly, trace Israel's story for us. But these women are more than just bystanders to Israel. Each of these, as we've explored the last couple of weeks, morally questionable foreign women, each of them confronts Israel. Though the way that they confront Israel through the way that they are treated by the Israelites. And they confront Israel by their reactions to these Israelites. And in each instance, these women pose for us the question, are God's people faithfully doing God's will? Are God's people faithfully doing God's will? How do we answer a question like that? And I don't mean God's will in the sort of more superficial ways that it gets popularly used, questions about spouses and colleges and careers and moves. I'm talking about the will of God. That regardless of whom you marry, where you work, which college you attend, or where you live, it is that will which never changes. The will of God for all of creation, his purposes for his people. These women and their interactions with Israelites give us a way of measuring the faithfulness of God's people. The reason Matthew includes these stories at the beginning of his gospel, at the beginning of his Jesus story, is because this is the question that Jesus will constantly pose to his people, though in various forms. But in essence, are you faithfully doing God's will? As we read the first part of Jesus' genealogy for the third week in a row, then I want to hear this confrontation between each female foreigner and God's people. And so what we'll do, we'll start in 1:1, and at each woman, we'll kind of pause for a break. The book of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez, and Zerah by Tamar. After Judah refuses to bless Tamar, Tamar's actions pose this question. What will God's people do when they realize they don't even know God? Back to the genealogy. And Perez, the father of Hezron, and Hezron, the father of Ram, and Ram, the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab, the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon, the father of Salmon, and Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. After Rahab proves to be a more faithful witness than Israel's spies, Rahab's actions pose the question, what will God's people do when they find they have been unfaithful in their witness? Reading again. And Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth. When Ruth travels to Israel as a poor foreign widow, her actions pose the question, what will God's people do when comfort and security leads everyone to do what is right in their own eyes? This is the story that we'll be exploring more in a few minutes. But let's finish the genealogy. And Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David, the king, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. When Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, has her life turned upside down by the king, her actions pose the question, what will God's people do when power and wealth corrupt? God's will, revealed to Abraham, passed down to each generation of Israelites, is that God's people would bless the nations. The last 2 weeks, we explored the Israelites' failures in being this blessing. As Claudia pointed out earlier, sometimes it can be heavy to continue to focus on the failures of these people, and yet Matthew takes us through both of these stories. First Judah, and then the Israelite spies, really as representative of the Israelite people. But one of the essential things that we learned the last 2 weeks was that God's ability to bless was not dependent on Israel's faithfulness. This is really important. God's ability to bless is not dependent on Israel's faithfulness. In both instances, first with Tamar and then Rahab, foreigners were blessed by God and welcomed into God's family, even though an Israelite or two did their very best to undermine that blessing. What this tells us is that God's will is to bless the world, to bless his creation, to bless the nations. God's will, however, is that his people would do that blessing for him. But if his people refuse, God is able to do it himself. This is good news for us. This week, the story of Ruth gives us an alternative to God working in spite of his people. This week, through a man named Boaz, we see that God can also work through his people. That this is actually his preferred method. Because of Boaz and his faithfulness, a foreigner, an outsider, is blessed and is welcomed among God's people, God's family. So like the last 2 weeks, I'd like for someone to help us out by retelling this story. Basically, this month through Advent, I'm working with the basic assumption that with the daily worship guide, you're reading and then summarizing the story the first day, and that whoever you're reading with the rest of the week, you're retelling that story and you're answering questions based on it. So by the time we show up on Sunday, we should all be experts in retelling this wonderful tale. So who has got it for us?
So
okay.
We had Naomi and her husband and their 2 sons.
Yes.
Moved to Moab. There was a famine in the land, and so they left. While they were there, the sons married 2 Moabite women. One was Orpah, not Oprah, and Ruth. And the dad died, and then later on the 2 sons died. And the famine, I guess, went away, and there was food in the land again. So Naomi said, we will go back. I'm going to go back to the land. You 2 go. I don't want to burden you anymore. You can go to your homes. I'm not going to be able to find you. I don't have anyone else to give to you to marry. So they move. She offers that to them, but Ruth decides to stay with her. Ruth and Naomi move back, and then they go to the land of Boaz's land, and he is a kin of her husband. And so they have Ruth go and work the land and present herself around him so that he would notice her. He notices her and says that you could be like one of my servants. I'll treat you better so that you don't get molested or anything. I'll protect you, basically.
Yeah.
And so then she goes back to Naomi, and everything's going well. And then Naomi says, okay, go and uncover his feet and lay at his feet.
What is that?
So, I don't really understand. But then she does that, and Boaz is like, blah, 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 blah. I'm gonna talk to the elders, and we will find you. We will take care of you, basically. And then he goes to the elders and said, somebody please take her, or I will marry her to fulfill the law and to do what's right. And so then he ends up marrying. Oh wait, this is too far.
No, that's fine. So we got the whole book.
Sorry.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Anybody else want to add any details? Don't forget the baby. Which baby?
Well, Ruth and Boaz have a baby.
Yes, they have a baby, and that baby becomes part of this line, this genealogy. Yep. What? Anybody else?
Naomi said?
No, Ruth said to Naomi. Yep. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Yeah. Fulfilling the responsibility to take Ruth as a wife actually also requires the cost of redeeming Naomi's land, which is an expensive. You're basically taking on the debt of that land. Yeah. Cool. And the 2 things that Lauren hit right there are significant is that he cares for her in the fields where she's gleaning, but then she comes to him and essentially propositions him. And in this context, there wouldn't have necessarily been anything weird about that, but refusing to essentially use his power and opportunity, Boaz refuses to accept her proposition in the middle of the night where his feet have been uncovered, and instead goes through the appropriate means, not only taking her as a wife, but redeeming Naomi's property as well. So I think some of that is also helpful to see kind of the big picture of who Boaz is and what Boaz does. And so this ability to retell this story, Lauren, you did a great job, and thanks for the ways that you guys added to that, is important as we internalize these stories, as they become something that's a story that belongs to us, that it's our own story. These are our people. And so we begin thinking about what this might mean. And the truth is this story is longer about Ruth and Boaz. It's 4 chapters than either of the last 2 stories. And so it's literally impossible for us to deal with every detail in the story. But there are at least several things that we can point out, that we can highlight, that are here. And one is its context. The book of Ruth opens with this introduction. In the days, chapter 1, verse 1, in the days when the judges ruled and there was a famine in the land. And there are two things that this introduction tells us. The story takes place during the time of the judges. The book of Judges describes this time as being, saying this: in those days, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There's a kind of lawlessness or anarchy that's present in this time and in this community. And the other thing is, to do what is right in your own eyes is contrasted with the command given to Moses, that Moses passes to Joshua, and that Joshua gives to the people, that they are to be careful to do everything according to the law of Moses. These are seen as a contrast to each other. The other thing we learn from this introduction is that God has already begun to judge his people for their lawlessness. So according to the covenant that God has made with Israel, the covenant that Israel agreed to, famine is one of those results or signs that the Israelites are living against or apart from God. And so with one sort of sweeping introductory sentence, the book of Ruth frames our story. This is a rebellious and a wicked time. This is the norm. This is what we should expect. And then you get Boaz emerging in the story as someone who is distinct and different. The very first scene where Boaz appears, he's interacting with his workers. And I love that somebody who has some familiarity with owning land and having people who might work it connected with this detail. He offers these workers a word of blessing. The Lord be with you. And they answer, the Lord bless you. And between this verse, his words here, and some of what follows, perhaps what comes to mind is the blessing that Moses gives to Aaron and his sons in Numbers, where we hear the words, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. These words of blessing were a hope-filled pronouncement that God and his people would share this intimate fellowship with each other. And this is what Boaz is speaking when he says, the Lord be with you. We gain this sort of immediate sense in our first interaction with Boaz that he is a man who cares for his workers. Because, see, the law is filled with rules and regulations about how you're to treat your employees. And our immediate sense is that Boaz is a man who upholds the law in these regards. He not only cares for his workers, however, with his words, he wishes God's best for them. And so he comes to his field and he notices this young woman who is new in a community like this. You would notice somebody who is new to the community. These are smallish towns and villages. And so she would stand out to him as somebody who was strange and foreign, probably. And he seeks to know something about her. Right? Who is she? How many times does somebody show up in worship with us? Who's that guy? Right? I mean, because we're a small enough community that anybody who's new sort of immediately stands out. And so we recognize, I want to find something out about that person. What can I know about them? What are they doing here, right? This is what Boaz seems to be trying to figure out. And Boaz hears her story. Her story of traveling from Moab. Her story of being so faithful and kind to Naomi. And he offers her words that are words of sheer and utter kindness. He calls her daughter. He calls her daughter. Consider this. A foreign woman who has left her father's home to be married, who's married and then loses her husband, who loses her father-in-law, literally has no male figure in her life, has been approached by this Israelite man who with great compassion calls her daughter. this term of endearment, of embrace, of compassion, of care. But there's more here, right? He invites her to join this group of women who have been experiencing Boaz's protection and provision. And this says a couple things. First, it isn't as though Ruth is uniquely special. As a foreigner, she is certainly unique in this community, but Boaz seems to be a man who routinely fulfills the law, which means that he is constantly giving widows access to the food that's left behind by harvesters in his field, because this is what's required of you by the law. And so there are already women who are constantly gathering this food from his fields. Boaz has been faithfully serving these other women, and now Ruth is invited to join with them. And he also then extends to her promises to protect her, promises to provide water for her throughout her work. Boaz is a man who lives at a time when everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. Socially speaking, he would have every excuse to do as everyone else is doing. And yet Boaz refuses to live that way. Instead, he seeks to do all that the law requires, except that the law makes no stipulation about providing protection for the widows that go through your field, just that you allow them to do so. And the law doesn't make any stipulation that you provide water for the widows that are gathering in your field, but he does that as well. See, Boaz is actually taking initiative. Something greater than the law is motivating Boaz so that he doesn't bump up against the law and stop there and say, time to turn in, I've done a good day's work. He goes beyond it. He pushes beyond it. And when he sees someone in need, he cares for them. He cares for their need. He meets them where they're at. This is the story of Boaz. Boaz is not a man who does what is right in his own eyes. Boaz is a man who does more than the law even requires of him, and he's eager to do so. Boaz is a man of initiative. Boaz is a man who seeks to be faithful to God. Boaz is a man of blessing even foreigners. For the Israelites, that was a pretty tough one. Consistently. Where Tamar and Rahab were blessed by God. Rahab and Tamar, going back to last 2 weeks, were blessed by God in spite of Judah and the Israelites. Ruth receives God's blessing through Boaz, through his faithful actions. Boaz welcomes Ruth among the Israelites, and then ultimately, and we didn't read this week, but it was shared. The story then climaxes when Boaz welcomes Ruth personally and at great financial cost into his own family. Throughout the story, Boaz is described with characteristics normally associated with God. Right? God is the one who looks upon people with favor. And yet Boaz is the one who looks upon Ruth with favor. God is the one who comforts. He is the comforter, and yet Boaz comforts. God is the one who redeems, and yet Boaz is the redeemer. This is God's will. God desires to bless the nations, but he wants to do it through his people. When his people extend God's love and hospitality and care and compassion to others, it is though those people who receive those things receive it from God himself. When we jump forward to the story of Jesus, Ruth begins to make all the sense in the world because Jesus will be the faithful Boaz, extending God's love and invitation to all of the nations of the world. And like Ruth, her fellow Gentiles will find a place among God's people. God's word comes to us as a double-edged sword. For some, we hear this message this morning as Ruth, as an outsider, being invited into God's family? Will we respond to God's invitation? Will we join God's family? Will we declare, your people will be my people, your God will be my God? But for those who have already chosen to follow Jesus, those who already belong in God's family, who have already found a home, we are confronted by Boaz's faithfulness. Do we go with the crowd doing what is right in our own eyes? Do we do what the law requires of us? Or, like Boaz, are we eager to go beyond the law? Are we motivated to carry out God's will in blessing our neighbors with radical hospitality? Do we desire to bless strangers and foreigners among us with joyful generosity? Are we passionate in being a blessing to even our enemies, showing them God's compassion and kindness? As I was thinking this week or in the last day or so, I was just coming up with a couple quick examples of ways we've probably seen this around us. And Laura, this is really interesting. Laura has came to Derek and said, hey, I mean, I'm a participant in worship on Sunday mornings, but how can I serve you? How can I help you do your job so that I can help our community worship? And often in the halls during the week, I hear Laura practicing her guitar, learning, growing, doing far more than anyone sort of expects or has necessarily even asked of her, to serve us as a community, to help us give our very best worship to God. And I was thinking about that this week, and I was thinking about Janet this week as well. I know Anthony asked her to help out with some things for the reception on Friday, and it's just Janet's heart that when Anthony says, "Hey, could you do maybe some drinks and maybe some brownies?" that Janet would spend the night before doing far more than coffee and brownies and making extra desserts and right, just going beyond what has been asked of her. And I mean, we could go through our community and we could identify these places and these moments are the work that continues to happen on Sunday mornings, week after week, by a group of people who are so motivated by God's love to show up and to plan meals for part of our community every single week, to take that initiative, to go beyond the law. Is so powerful. And I hope each of you are able to see the ways in which that kind of desire to be faithful is at work among us. And my hope, my desire is that we'd continue to spur one another on in these ways, to continue to pursue God and to serve him and to honor him over and beyond sort of the bare minimum that it's sometimes easy to settle for. As we explore our faithfulness, the answers are often in our past, sometimes our recent past, and sometimes extending back a number of years. As we ask questions of where have we come from? Who have we been? What have we done? Have we lived lives of ridiculously excessive love? Because that's what Boaz demonstrates for us. Excessive gestures that, had he not done these things, nobody would have given him a second thought. But he does it because he's compelled to. Have we done just what is required of us? Because there's a standard and I was able to check it off and now I feel all right. Or have we sort of been living, doing what is right in our own eyes? This is what I feel like doing, and so this is how I'm going to live. As we look at our past, as we look at our days, as we evaluate faithfulness, We look at the ways that we spend our time, and we look at the ways that we spend our money, and we look at the ways, the people that we invite into our home, and we look at those who we welcome into our families, and we look at our goals, and we look at our relationships, and when everyone else is doing what is right in their own eyes, we continue to look to find favor in God's eyes, to have God move through us and work through us as his faithful servants.